So one of the biggest mistakes I think we see is people thinking about intellectual property too late. And they start to run up against those deadlines and they lose out on some of the property rights. So my biggest thing, biggest piece of advice, I guess, would be to think about intellectual property early and often. Intellectual property is one of those things that you can lose out on, and not just from the typical ways that we hear people, inventors and entrepreneurs, complain that someone else is ripping them off. Right? Sometimes they're their own worst enemy, as far as making sure they're getting their intellectual property on time.
Hey everyone, this is Devin Miller here with another episode of the Inventive Journey. I'm your host, Devin Miller, the serial entrepreneur that's grown several businesses into 7- and 8-figure companies, as well as the founder and CEO of Miller IP Law, where he helps startups and small businesses with their patents and trademarks. And if you ever need help with yours, just go to strategymeeting.com and we're always here to help. Now, today we have a bit of a different guest on. Normally we always have founders, co-founders, entrepreneurs, and other startups. Darrin is Darrin Burnham, and he is one of the attorneys at Miller IP Law. And so we, as you can catch with most of our intros, we, myself and a few of the other attorneys at the firm, help startups and small businesses with their patents and trademarks. And so Darrin's one of the attorneys here at Miller IP Law that helps out with everybody, works on their matters, and gets it going. So as an introduction, or as a way to introduce Darrin, wanted to kind of talk through a bit of his journey, how he got started, where he started at, how he got, or what degrees he has, where he's worked, and how he ended up at Miller IP Law, and just doing patent law in general. So with that much as an introduction, welcome on the podcast, Darrin.
Thanks, Devin. I appreciate it.
So maybe to start out with, tell us a little bit about kind of undergraduate, what you were doing, and then how you first of all got into intellectual property or IP law.
Sure. So I studied mechanical engineering at the University of Utah, and it was actually during my undergraduate that I got introduced to intellectual property. I was good friends with a gentleman who had gone to law school and had just started up his own practice, and he offered to introduce me to intellectual property, and I took him up on it. And what was supposed to be just a 2-week introduction or so turned into much more of a relationship and a little bit of a career path change. I had actually intended to go on and probably get a master's in engineering, go work for some engineering firm or company in-house with them developing their products. But once I got the taste of intellectual property in my mouth, I decided I was going to change pace a little bit. So ended up going to law school after I graduated, worked through my undergraduate for Holman IP Law, which became Wilson Hammond Holman at some point, and worked through the undergraduate, went to law school, worked for the same firm all through law school, and then a few years after I graduated from law school.
So before you dive in, one question following up. So, I mean, I don't know if you're like me, and everybody has their own experience. You get into what is, engineering school, and it's very technical. It's very, A plus B equals C. You do the math, you do the calculations, and and you're good to go. And then you get into law school, and it's for me at least, it was a fairly big mind shift. And now I have to write papers and lay it out, the arguments, and there isn't necessarily an A plus B equals C, and it's all subjective. It all depends, and so it's always kind of that. And that not only that, you're competing against everybody else that for their undergraduate they were doing writing, they were writing to the professor, they were used to that. And so what was your experience in law school? Was it a major mind shift? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Did you work your way through it? Kind of how did law school go as you were shifting from engineering to doing more law in general before graduating and going to intellectual property?
Sure, yeah, there definitely is a bit of a shifting approach, and how you handle and are successful in engineering versus how you're successful in law school. It definitely was more of a shift for me than probably most at law school, just because I came from a technical background. It was interesting in some of the first few classes that you went to, everybody went around the room and you kind of introduced yourself, where you're from, what you studied before you came to law school. And a lot of heads in the room kind of turned when I said I studied engineering before coming to law school. It's pretty common to have the political science, English, history majors, things like that. And most of my classmates in law school came in with that background. There were very few of us that came in with an engineering background. And yeah, you do have to make some adaptations. Um, Coming in and writing persuasive papers versus a technical analysis is a very different thing. But I think it did actually lend itself pretty well because as engineers we're fairly organized. We're able to kind of set things out in a structure. And a lot of the arguments that you make, a lot of the persuasive um, viewpoints that you put out there benefit from having a really nice structure, a nice way of stepping through those arguments. And so I think engineering kind of lended itself to that a bit. But it was certainly a shift. With engineering, you got the right answer and your widget works, or you don't have the right answer and something just doesn't work.
So
In law
now
school,
I'm going to follow up with one more question. So I mean, every now I'm going even further back in time, which is the wrong direction, but we'll catch up to after you graduate. But you mentioned a little bit about because you had plans to go for engineering. You did undergraduate in mechanical engineering. You're going to go for a master's. You talked with somebody you knew about maybe for patent law, but what was it that, for lack of a better word, drove you away from engineering or drove you to patent law? Because engineering is a good career and you can do that, and a lot of people have done it and successful, and it's a good thing. So what made you say, okay, I'd rather be going into patent law as opposed to going into or furthering your career in engineering?
yeah, good question. One of the big things was I was really interested in kind of cutting edge technology. And what I wanted to do was eventually work as an engineer in research and development.
Mm.
But the more that I kind of asked around and asked the question, how do you get to R&D? How do you get into research and development? How do you get to work with some of those new cutting edge technologies? The answer that kept coming back was, oh, we'll just work in industry for 20, 25, 30 years and you'll get there.
Mm.
And that sounded horrible. I wanted to work in it now. I wanted to be working with new technologies, seeing some of the exciting stuff that was coming out of these companies and these engineering firms. But I wanted to see it before 20, 25, 30 years in the industry. So as I started to get my feet wet with intellectual property, I found that's exactly what we do with intellectual property. We start from day one looking at new technologies, figuring out why these things are cool, what kind of advantages they're going to bring to science, to technology, to the arts, and how it's going to impact lives. We do that from day one, not 20, 25, 30 years down the road. So being able to work with that new technology immediately was one of the big convincing factors.
No, and that makes perfect sense. And that's probably a little bit, a little bit a similar story in the sense that I kind of got to the end of the engineering school. I didn't want to be an engineer, but I wanted to still work with technology. And so you kind of, otherwise, to your point, you work on a very small project for a long period of time. You're stuck on it for months or years at a time. And eventually you'll work your way up to you'll actually get to work on the cool technology after being in grunt for a period of time. And I decided I didn't want to do that. So now, with that realization, you did an mechanical engineering undergraduate, went and graduated from law school, and you're coming out of law school. So, looking at jobs, you'd already worked for the firm or for the person that you knew worked at their firm for a period of time. Did you continue to work there? Did you go somewhere else? Kind of how was that transition? Where did you work with? Who did you work for? What kind of clients, and how did that go?
Yeah, good question. So I was one of the lucky ones that kind of knew where I was going coming out of law school. I had, a position lined up. Didn't have to worry about doing the job hunting thing coming out of law school. Already had a firm that I was working with and was going to continue to work with. And I did for a number of years after that. There was a little bit of a shift in the firm. The owner decided to go in house with a larger firm downtown Salt Lake. And I decided to take a different path during that transition. So it was then that I went over and started working with Lowenstein Sandler at the time that they were kind of establishing their Utah office. And that's where you and I first met. Devin was over there. as we were both working with Lowenstein Sandler, great, very large firm based in New Jersey, and kind of the IP center in Palo Alto in California. Um, had a great opportunity to work with Kevin Grange, learned from him, some great people over there. Had another opportunity with another firm come up after that. But during the time that I was with Lowenstein Sandler, I got to work with a number of really cool clients, a lot of medical device clients, a lot of software. Worked with a lot of big names, and I guess starting back with home and IP law, kind of cut my teeth with IBM and some software, and then with Lowenstein Sandler, same thing. Worked with Red Hat and Google, and a bunch of medical device technology, some chemical and material science end of things, a little bit of robotics, especially with respect to some of the medical device. Got a really good breadth of experience with Lowenstein Sandler. And then from there, went to another firm, looked for something a little more local as far as the headquarters. So worked with a firm that was based out of Salt Lake City called Kunzler, Bean and Adamson. It actually went through a couple of different name shifts while I was with them, but was with them for a number of years. And again, got to continue to work with some big name clients and some startups. Found that I like to have a little bit of balance of both. Having working with some of the big name clients is fun, but I also found that I enjoyed working with the startups, working with the small companies, the entrepreneurs that are just getting going. I found that it was, while it was nice to work with the big name clients, and it was easy to work with them because they had some established processes in place. And it was good work. It wasn't as fulfilling as working with the startups. It felt like you made more of a difference instead of being a small cog in a really big machine. With the big clients, you were a very important piece of the strategy, very important piece of the team when you're working with the startups. A little bit more that has to go into, educating the inventors and the entrepreneurs there, helping make a difference there. But it's really fulfilling to be able to step in at that level and help clients out in that way. So after a couple of years with Kunzler, Bean and Adamson, had the opportunity, reconnected with you and with Jedi, who is another attorney at the firm, and decided it might be a good move to jump back into working more with some of the startups and the small to mid-sized entrepreneurs, and the rest is history.
Been here ever since. So now
right.
Going through a little bit of your journey. So now you worked with some of the bigger law firms. You work with some of the medium law firms. Miller IP Law is an awesome law firm, but it is on the smaller side. And so as you go through it, what was the giving people an insight, what was the benefit, or what did you like about the large law firms? What did you like about the small law firms? And if you're kind of, putting yourself in the bit of the client's shoes, which one would be how should they go about making a decision, or why would you recommend, if you're to look back at the different law firms you work with, is there a benefit to a bigger law firm, smaller law firm? How do you make those decisions, and based on, which ones you liked and kind of your experience with them?
Yeah, good question. First, from my perspective, one of the reasons why I came over to Miller IP Law was because I liked that small firm feel, right? I liked having a little bit more involvement. Just like I mentioned with the clients, I prefer working with some of the small clients because it's more fulfilling. You're more involved. Same thing with the firms. With the smaller firm where I started at Home and IP Law, it was a little bit of a smaller firm. I was actually the first employee at that firm, and it got to have a lot of say in how things went with marketing and reaching out, identifying the kind of clients we wanted to help out and how best to help them out. And we were really agile that way. It was a more dynamic practice. We could kind of tailor make ourselves and fit the services that we provided to our clientele, and help them the best way possible. And then that's very different at a large firm. It's more of a rigid structure. They kind of have things set in place. They know where they want to be and how they want to do it. And each individual attorney has very little influence on that. Um, so I think that's a huge selling point for the smaller firms. If you find a big firm that's a great fit, then that's fantastic. But are they going to be a great fit for everybody? Probably not. The smaller firms can be more agile. We can identify exactly the kind of clientele that we want to be able to help, exactly the kind of inventor. We've picked out the startups and the small entrepreneurs, and we've been able to tailor ourselves because we're smaller and can be more agile,
Mm.
and change our approach. We're able to help them in the ways that they really need it, and provide a greater value and be a better asset to them than even some of the big dollar and big name firms. We can provide even better service than you would find there.
No, and I'm agreeing with you. I mean, it's certainly a bit of a self-biased answer because obviously I started the law firm to do it a bit differently. But I do think that, the fun thing about working at a small law firm is you get to have a greater impact and influence on how you work with the clients. And you can actually give them advice, you can give them strategy, you can sit down with them versus with the bigger companies. Oftentimes they're not, and the bigger law firms, you have a rigid way of you doing it. You want to make sure it's done the exact same way, and you don't have quite that ability to strategize and sit down with them. Well, I always have two questions at the end of each podcast. We're going to change them up slightly, but ask you, so along your career journey, or along the law firms and along the educational journey in that, what was the biggest decision, or what was the biggest mistake you ever made, and what did you learn from it?
Interesting, a good question. um, I don't know what I would say is my biggest mistake.
So how
uh,
about I give you a second to think, and I'll give you my biggest mistake, and that will give you a bit of a time to think about yours. So, if I were to look and say, what is the biggest, I don't know if it was a mistake, but it's one where I've had now 150 plus interviews with various people or entrepreneur startups and small businesses. And I would say the number one note that I hear from them is that they wish they got started sooner, and they wish that they got started more quickly, and they spent a lot of their career and their time and efforts working for other companies or other businesses, and then they've started their own business or their own or startup, and that's what they love, and they wish they got started earlier in their career. And that's probably a little bit the same with me at Miller IP Law. As what I've been doing the law firm now, we're coming up on 3 years since it was started, and it's been fun, it's been enjoyable. There's certainly ups and downs and times that are fun that are not, but I wish I'd probably got started sooner. And so it's one of those where you can always look back. So with that would be my biggest mistake, and my also advice would be to get started sooner when you find something that you love and you want to do. So I gave you a bit of time to think. So I don't know if you thought of anything else that would be your biggest mistake that you would change.
yeah. I mean, the timeline thing is a common thread with a lot of people, and that might be something that I would probably list. There's been a number of opportunities where I've had to be more involved with a couple of different companies that I've helped, and because of usually hesitance on the part of the firm to see attorneys be involved with the clients on a different level than just as their attorney, but maybe as an investor or as someone who's actually involved on a board or something like that. I've had a couple of opportunities to do that, and just because of the firm I was with, had to pass on those opportunities. And I think it could have been a really good opportunity that I could have taken advantage of and would have turned out really good. And it's always one of those woulda, coulda, shoulda. Hindsight's 2020, right? It's hard to say exactly how that would have worked out, but that's probably one of my bigger regrets. Is there were some opportunities that I passed up a little bit, and would have been interesting to see how they played out.
All right, great answer. Now that you had the time to think about it, now I'm going to ask my second question. I'm going to tweak it a little bit. Normally, the question is, if you're talking to a startup or a small business, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give them? I'll tweak that slightly. If you're talking to a startup or a small business, given that you're intellectual property, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give them with regards to intellectual property?
Uh, yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is know when those intellectual property rights become at risk, right? We get a lot of times inventors, and it's awesome. They get really excited about what they've got, right? And they want to tell the world. They want to get out there. They want to be at the trade shows. They want to get their product out on a platform like Amazon, or they want to go do a GoFundMe or an Indiegogo. They want to get out there and kickstart their path because they're excited about what they've got. Unfortunately, sometimes intellectual property gets pushed off to the side a little bit. They get caught up in that excitement. They really want to get out. They really want to show the world. They want to start selling their product. And they don't realize that a lot of times that starts a certain set of clocks for their intellectual property rights. As soon as they start to share that with the world, and it's great that they're excited about it, but that sets some deadlines for when their intellectual property becomes public, becomes owned by everybody. So one of the biggest mistakes I think we see is people thinking about intellectual property too late. And they start to run up against those deadlines and they lose out on some of the property rights. So my biggest piece of advice, I guess, would be to think about intellectual property early and often. Intellectual property is one of those things that you can lose out on, and not just from the typical ways that we hear people, inventors and entrepreneurs, complain that someone else is ripping them off, right? Sometimes they're their own worst enemy, as far as making sure they're getting their intellectual property on time. So that'd be probably my biggest thing.
All right. Well, that's a good piece of advice that people can take to heart. Well, as we wrap up, I already know the answer, but I'll ask you anyway. If people want to reach out, they want to be your client, they want to find out more, or they otherwise want to pick your brain about intellectual property questions, what's the best way to connect up with you?
Yeah, the best way is just to check out our website. Head over to milleripl.com and check out the resources that we've got available. We've got a lot of things from kind of self-help products that we can get you started, and you can get in with a pretty slick set of tools. And then if they want to, if the clients want to reach out, we've got a great set of attorneys here. I'd love to help out. We've got a lot of breadth of experience, a huge range of backgrounds. We're able to help out pretty much everybody. So,
all right.
yeah.
And I'll plug for Darrin himself as well. If you want to or grab some time on Darrin's schedule or otherwise meet with him specifically, you can go to meetdarrin.com. Darrin is spelled Darrin. So just go to meetdarrin.com and you can grab some time specifically on his calendar. So, well, thank you for coming on. It's been fun. It's been a pleasure. Wish the next leg of your journey, and hopefully with Miller IP Law, but wherever you go, success.
Thanks, Devin. I appreciate the opportunity.